Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown are insisting that nuclear energy is the only option for the future. They say it's the only viable alternative to climate change producing oil, gas and coal. But they're wrong. There is a safe, non-polluting, cost-effective and sustainable alternative. It's called concentrating solar power. It can provide the world's entire electricity needs in perpetuity, and it can also be a vehicle for the development of some of the world's most impoverished nations. With me to discuss concentrating solar power is Neil Crumpton of Friends of the Earth. He's a specialist in climate change and renewable energy. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you first to explain what exactly is concentrating solar power. What's the technology involved?
Okay, well, it's a very simple and what's more a tried and tested technology which comprises mirrors, parabolic mirrors typically spread out in a hot desert area which focus the sun's rays on tubes of oil or water which generate steam for electricity generation. So it's a way of generating electricity using tried and tested technology from solar power essentially. So it's renewable, everlasting in that sense, and because the world's deserts are so large, could provide a very great capacity of our energy needs, not just electricity needs.
Yeah, a report recently to the German government suggested that just by covering, I think it's 0.5% of the world's deserts in these giant mirrors to create concentrating solar power, all of the world's electricity needs could be met.
That's right. It
seems almost too good to be true.
It's true, and the thing is that this technology, as I say, it's been tried and tested in the Mojave Desert in California since the 1980s. So it's been working for 15 years.
And they're also doing it now in Spain and Australia as well.
The Spanish and other countries now are suddenly waking up to the fact that they've got this fantastic resource. Because energy, fossil fuel energy, is beginning to cost more. Oil is going up in terms of $60 a barrel now. What was a relatively expensive technology in those days, in the 80s, is now very competitive. Even the current technology is competitive with oil at $60 a barrel. With any kind of scale-up of this technology, essentially mirrors, it's a large volume production, as it were, will bring the price down. The German government funded study suggests that it would be something like 3p or even less per kilowatt hour that's generated in the desert. There is a way of getting it using what's called a low-loss electricity grid that can, for the addition of 1 pence or something like that per kilowatt hour, deliver it over a 3,000-mile distance.
So basically, in, for example, North Africa, a relatively small area of Algeria or Morocco or Libya, the deserts there, could be used to generate this electricity and pipe it to Western Europe and supply all our needs.
Exactly. Any one of those countries you mentioned, from Egypt across to Morocco, could generate all the world's electricity in themselves. Obviously, that wouldn't happen in practice, but there are deserts in southern Africa, which is important because as climate change is having is likely to have a big effect there. Obviously, all the Sahara and the Middle East. But importantly, there's hot deserts in California and the United States, the western deserts, in South America, in Pakistan and India, Australia, obviously, but also extending up into China as well. So in terms of the resource and the spread of the resource, that does suggest that every continent can benefit. Most countries can benefit if they're anywhere near one of these hot deserts. And 90% of the world's population are within certainly 3,000 miles, and most probably less than 2,000 miles. So most of humanity can benefit from this technology.
And as you say, a lot of quite poor countries like Namibia, lots of deserts, relatively poor African country, but great potential to use this technology as a motor for its own economic development.
Absolutely.
And when people talk about China, they say, well, it's no use us doing anything about it, climate change, because China's just going to be building more coal-fired power stations and so on, negating any benefits and changes that we make. But of course, as you say, there are vast areas of China which are deserts and which could have this technology applied as well and be more cost-effective, I believe, in the long term than their existing reliance on coal-fired.
Yeah, as soon as you begin to manufacture at scale, the costs will come down significantly. There's obviously a learning curve in any technology. The Spanish are building about a gigawatt, so it's about one power station's worth in our terms. But by the time they've built about 5 gigawatts, we'll know what kind of prices we're looking at. But it's expected to be very cost competitive. The point about the scale-up of the technology is that countries with the resources now, the economic resources, need to start now. We can't waste time wondering whether this... we need to demonstrate the technology. We have to make decisions in 5 and 10 years to start reducing carbon dioxide significantly. Otherwise, it's far more difficult as each 5-year, 10-year period goes by in reducing the climate gases to the levels we need for climate protection. So I would suggest that the German governments have been very visionary in this sense, and it's really for the countries of Europe and indeed the United States to really press ahead with this technology. The Australians are waking up to it. They're obviously very big into coal and nuclear because they've got uranium resources, but in Australia has got vast solar energy resources. The other thing about this technology is that it's cooled. Because it's a steam technology, it can be cooled by seawater, and then you can desalinate the seawater. And it's not a small byproduct, it's a very significant byproduct, up to 40 litres per kilowatt hour. And that could make a vast difference in many of the countries, obviously with the increasing desertification of the desert areas. That kind of quantity of desalinated seawater would be almost transformative in terms of agricultural production and people's ability to live without water wars, for example.
Yeah. So in a sense, really the desalination option, that this power is used for desalination, could resolve freshwater crises in large regions of the world. It could also, of course, water agriculture in famine-stricken areas. And I understand that there are proposals and ideas that because the mirrors in the desert create large areas of shade, that actually under the mirrors they could become the new hydroponic agricultural areas producing food for those regions. Yeah. So this could be a food-producing thing as well.
That's right, yeah, and there's certainly great potential for using the shade under the mirrors. One criticism that has been levelled about concentrating solar is that, desert ecosystems are very fragile. If you start putting mirrors all over the deserts, then you're going to damage that ecosystem as well. I think the answer to the response to that is that one would only, in any practical sense, be using maybe 1 or 2% of the world's deserts, and you obviously wouldn't choose the most sensitive parts. But even then, what you're creating is an ecosystem based on shade and indeed some water, because the mirrors themselves are cleaned by water. They're turned upside down at night and cleaned with water. So there would be some kind of ecology growing under the mirrors. It wouldn't necessarily be desert ecology of what's there now, but there's certainly you could make use. But obviously it would be protecting the far greater ecology of the Earth's biosphere. If we go down that route.
But it does seem like a win-win situation. Here you've got, not only sustainable, safe, non-polluting energy, but you've got, a massive potential increase in global freshwater supplies and a huge boost to agriculture, particularly in arid underdeveloped regions where starvation and malnutrition have historically plagued millions and millions of people.
Absolutely. And it's in a way a very good, well-kept secret, but it's time to start talking.
Why do you think this is?
I really don't know. I think partly because there's not much desert in Europe. There is actually some desert in Europe, in southern Spain. And perhaps we've been slightly cautious, certainly in Europe, about what might be considered by some as exploitation of Africa, or dependence on African resources. But there's another way to look at that. One could certainly look at it. The German group that are promoting this technology, particularly, or who've been doing so for 5 years, certainly regard it as a cooperation between Saharan Africa and Europe. And there's people in Saharan African countries that are wanting this as much as the people in the European.
So it really could be a vehicle for greater global cooperation, and through that cooperation, breaking down national barriers and rivalries and building links between different parts of the world, which create a common interest in working together for the benefit of all humankind.
I would say it's one of the best examples of a sustainable trade with Africa that's certainly we can think of. Basically, it's water generating, it's climate protecting. Indeed, it protects the climate of Africa, which is probably going to be hit more hard than some European countries. And certainly the economic benefits to Africa would mean, presumably, that there would be less migration to Europe and possibly migration to African countries. But we have got the resources, the economic resources, and the technical understanding, as it were, we need to help Africa and all the other countries to develop. I mean, the United States do know about this technology. In the early Bush years, it got ignored, and they were promoting nuclear and coal, essentially clean coal. We don't know why that happened, but more recently with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California, he's very understanding of the power in the deserts in his backyard, as it were. The fairly well-known venture capitalist Vinod Khosla in America says that concentrating solar power won't succeed because it's green, it will succeed because it's cheap. And a lot of people now in the southern states of America are getting interested. Obviously there the technology transfer can be to Mexico, to South America, wherever.
You're just on this issue. Let's talk about costs. I'm right in saying that even now the cost is that concentrating solar power can produce as much energy as the equivalent amount of oil. So roughly the $50 a barrel was the old price. As you say, it's now gone up to about 60 or so. But in fact, concentrating solar power can produce equivalent amounts. And with the technology being improved, it can actually produce equivalent levels of energy that are being produced by oil, but at a much lower rate, maybe the equivalent of $20 a barrel.
They say that's probably as far as it may go. $20 a barrel is exceedingly cheap, even if it was a bit more than that.
Do you explain a bit more about it? Because I don't think I've expressed it very well.
Well, it's I would say about 3p. Both the American studies and the German
studies. Can you explain it in terms of cost of barrel?
In terms of barrels of oil, put it this way: every year, the equivalent of 1.5 million barrels of oil falls on every 1 kilometre square of hot desert around the world. That's about 8 inches deep pool across the desert. Now you can convert probably at between 1/3 and 2/3 of that into useful energy, be it electricity and desalinated water. as I say, when you bring in the cost of, and the value of the desalinated water, you bring in the costs down. But even so, the electricity costs are competitive now, and will certainly be more so in the future. And remember, this is carbon-free electricity as well. And so there's additional benefits there. So one would ask, why would you waste your time with fossil fuels in the future when you've got all this wonderful resource in many parts of the world?
I mean, in terms of where we go from here, I mean, the German government is interested. There's been a report to them. Is there any interest at the European Union level?
I think they're slightly cautious for some reason I don't understand.
Is it something to do with security? Because obviously, if the power is generated, say, in North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, and piped or whatever,
electricity grid lines.
Electricity grid lines, to Europe, then obviously, I suppose there is a danger and anxiety about their potential destruction by terrorist groups or unfriendly states.
Sure. Well, we are reliant to some degree, and an increasing degree, on gas pipelines filled with an explosive gas. To actually move electricity by metal wires is a lot less amenable to terrorists to damage the routes. You wouldn't only be supplying by one link. There'd be links, say, from across to Gibraltar, through Sicily, through around the Near East as well. There'd be possibly nine or 10, even more different links, the cables under the Mediterranean, as it were, and then you're into the European grid. So in terms, and we have to remember that we're already importing, and have done for many years, gas from Algeria and other northern Saharan states into Europe. If we become more dependent on Russian gas, it'd be a pipeline 3,000 miles long. So I'd say if you're looking at the relative terrorist threats, then I'd worry more about gas than I would about electricity. But having said that, there is no indication that Algeria, that's been a big supplier to Europe for many decades, has been anything other than but a reliable, and gas, a reliable supplier. And despite what's happened in Iraq, which hasn't helped, obviously, and it's in fact, we could have, instead of spent the last 5 years going into the Middle East for all those reasons, if we concentrated on solar power instead, I think this world would have been a lot better place. But we can start now. There's no reason why, but we need to start quickly. We need some demonstration plants around the place.
What are we talking about in terms of investment costs, say compared to the projected investment costs in the new generation of nuclear power stations?
Well, the costs issue of any technology is subject to so many different viewpoints. What I would say is that it's easier to cost a technology that's fairly simple in terms of its the amount of metal and the structure and the technology. The steam turbines have been around for generations, so but the new designs of nuclear power stations and all the fuel fabrication facilities, this is all new technology, so the costs are essentially unknown, although obviously there's a lot of positive spin in terms of what's being proposed.
But does anybody have any idea how much it's going to cost to set up, say, a major concentrating solar power network in somewhere in North Africa to provide a grid of electricity to Europe?
Well, the German studies have done it. I can't go into too much detail, but what's the way they work the cost out is in kilowatt hours delivered to your home, as it were. So it's the generation cost is, as I say, about 3p maybe, or possibly less, and a transmission cost of about a penny. So that's about the same as clean coal with carbon capture and storage, about this, probably the same as gas. As gas resources dwindle, the price will start to go up, and nuclear maybe 4p, maybe 7p. You know, it's very difficult to say. What I would say in the comparison, though, is that the global resource of desert energy in terms of concentrating solar power could be anything from 30% of our energy needs to 300 if we really needed. You know, it's a theoretical resource in that sense, but 30% could be a realistic proportion of where we'd be getting our 2050 energy from. So obviously you'd have wind and all the other renewables as well. But that compares with nuclear power, which provides 3.1% of global energy. It just doesn't compare. And if you tried to scale nuclear up, even double nuclear power, then not only would there be more countries around the world with nuclear reactors, with all the problems of proliferation that is bringing, but you'd also be needing to find new uranium resources which are not necessarily there. You're a hostage to fortune in the sense of uranium resources, where they're located, and all this kind of thing. It's far better to go for a 100% renewably powered world, and we can, because nuclear is far too dangerous. It's a limited technology, it's a distraction, and we can do without it. Unfortunately, Morocco is about to receive a delegation from Russia who are trying to sell them a cheap and cheerful nuclear reactor, and they may go down that route, which may cause a domino effect from Algeria right round the Near East and Turkey. All those countries have said that they're looking at civil nuclear power, and yet they've got deserts full of solar resources.
And what is the British government doing?
Not a lot.
Has it expressed any interest in this new technology?
No, I don't think. And the man who should be informing Blair, if anybody, is Sir David King, who's got obviously a big awareness about climate change. And Sir David King says he's got Blair's ear on energy. He's working with the DTI. He's working in climate politics, and so. Sir David King says he's aware of concentrating solar power, but as far as I know, he's not giving the ministers any kind of positive understanding of the issue.
Have representations been made to the Environment Minister, David Miliband?
We've sent communications too, but whether they get that far through the civil service, we simply don't know. And it's
you never had a reply from David Miliband. You've written to him, and he's never replied.
I can't say we've written to David Miliband. We've written to Peter Hain and Tony Blair just after 9/11, in fact, that many years ago, and we've written to people since.
I would strongly suggest you need to write direct to David Miliband.
Okay.
Put him on the spot. he talks green, sure. but here's a chance for him to deliver. Sure. He hasn't delivered so far. This is really, you put him on the spot.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll do that. I'll do that next week. We approach many politicians, verbally, and we've spoken about this. But
any interest in the House of Commons?
Yes, actually, there have been letters sent out to all MPs, and some people are interested, but that's as far as it gets until the DTI become involved. But in a way, in terms of UK, whether or not we import very much concentrated solar power from the Sahara is one thing. But what we do need to know, because we are a player on the world stage and hope to show global leadership qualities, then our ministers, our politicians have to know that this resource is in existence for the geopolitics of the world. And the indications are that they don't. Certainly Bush and Blair have shown no indication of promoting concentrating solar power as a safe and secure and a tried and tested alternative to nuclear power. And that is very, very sad in our view. Whether it'll change, I don't know. But Brown has got everything to play for. If his interest in African trade and social issues is as he says, then if he's briefed properly by his civil servants, then we should have an awareness. And
if we can't live on ifs.
Well,
we need not maybes, but definites. And I think this strikes me as a very important issue that ought to be given a much higher profile, and politicians need to be put on the spot.
Sure. I think Angela Merkel, of the German Chancellor, the German Minister, has been briefed properly, because I think the Germans see a technological and a manufacturing advantage there. Obviously, as some of the German companies are already raring to go. The British don't see that yet. We had a meeting with the DTI last week, to say that there is, apart from the geopolitics, there are potential for manufacturing in Britain as well. As I say, even if we don't import very much solar power because we're nervous about it or whatever, I don't think we should be. The first significant imports will be probably the 2020s. And I think the politics of the world and climate change will affect, we'll think the world will be a very different place, just like the 1980s were in retrospect. So I think we have everything to gain from building what's called a super grid around Europe, which would help renewables, renewable energy, be it offshore wind in the North Sea, to hydro in Norway, to the solar in the Sahara, and we can move around large amounts of energy as and when that energy is generated. But we need to build that quick.
So you're saying really concentrating solar power is part of a multi-plurality of energy sources which can work together to satisfy needs in different countries, but cumulatively and collectively can provide a range of different diverse resources, so there's not over-dependence on one particular technology. And in particular the concentrating solar power technology is one that is so sustainable and is obviously going to help develop many poorer, relatively undeveloped countries.
Absolutely. That's right. It's part of a larger mix of renewables, and it could be a very large part in some countries. It can also generate at night, by the way, so this is not just a daytime technology, because you can store some of the heat in molten salts or other methods of storing heat, so the steam turbines can work during the night. So it's essentially baseload electricity. And perhaps sometime in the future, using cheap electricity, you could also make synthetic hydrocarbons. It's a possibility. It's technically possible. Whether it's viable either now with current carbon costs or future concerns about climate taking the carbon cost higher, I don't know. But it certainly opens up very interesting possibilities in terms of making synthetic plastics, for example. They're not based on fossil fuels. But again, the German petrochemical industry is very interested in synthetic hydrocarbons. So it opens up a range of potential, not just in the electricity sector, but in the energy sector and the kind of plastics and fertilizers, ammonia production in those industrial sectors as well. So it's got amazing potential, but as I say, we're so focused on fossil fuels, or too many countries are, and we need to move on from that.
So really, we're talking about not just a new renewable energy source, but a new source of energy that can have wider economic impacts for those developing countries where many of these concentrating solar power stations will be based, but also globally in terms of off-spin industries and technologies. It sounds very, very exciting. I've really enjoyed hearing you, Neil, and as I said, get that letter to David Miliband tomorrow.
That's a promise, yes.
And it's very exciting to think that, with this technology, we could reduce carbon emissions by 70% by 2050.
Yeah.
And we can fulfill those goals.
Yeah.
So on that note, thank you very much for joining me this week. I look forward to seeing you next week for talking with Tatchell.